Ever feel like you're stuck watching reruns? Well, today we're diving into a book that might seem that way at first glance.
Oh, yeah.
First and Second Chronicles.
Okay.
You might be thinking, isn't that just like the same stuff as Samuel and Kings?
Right.
But trust me, there's a twist ending here you won't see coming.
That's right. It's not just a rehash.
Okay.
Think of it like this. Imagine someone is retelling like a classic movie, but they zoom in on certain scenes. Maybe they change the music.
Okay.
Maybe they even tack on a new ending.
Yeah.
It's the same story, but it hits you differently.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So where do we even begin with this director's cut of the Bible?
Well, first off, we need to remember that Chronicles was originally one big book
Okay.
and later split in two. And get this, it's the very last book in the Jewish Bible.
Huh.
That's a pretty important spot, right? It's like the grand finale. But here's the thing. The author is writing a few hundred years after the Israelites returned from exile in Babylon.
Yeah.
Things aren't exactly sunshine and roses back in Jerusalem.
Yeah, the back in the land, but it's not quite the glorious comeback they might have been hoping for.
Exactly. The Messiah hasn't shown up. The temple isn't rebuilt to its former glory, and the nations aren't exactly lining up to follow Israel's lead.
Right.
So the author of Chronicles is writing into this situation, using these familiar stories to offer a new perspective, a glimmer of hope.
So he's saying, hey, I know things are rough, but don't lose sight of the bigger picture. God's still got this.
You got it. And he does this by highlighting two major themes: the coming Messianic King and the promise of a glorious new temple.
Okay. That's interesting because right out of the gate, we're hit with those massive, and let's be honest, kind of boring genealogies.
Right.
I mean, most people just skip over those, right?
Right. But you know what's fascinating? The author is using these genealogies to do so much more than just list names. It's like he's recapping the entire Old Testament story,
Wow.
hitting all the key players and events, but he's also subtly weaving in these two crucial family lines.
Okay. The line of King David.
Leading to the promised Messiah, exactly, and then the priestly line of Aaron, the guys who ran the temple. He's setting the stage right from the start.
Okay, so we breeze through all those begats, and then we land in some familiar territory, the David stories.
Mm-hmm.
We know this guy from Samuel, the shepherd, the giant slayer, the king. But it's like someone cleaned up his Wikipedia page. All the messy stuff is gone.
It's true. No more drama with Saul, no mention of Bathsheba, just good guy David. But this isn't about whitewashing history. The author is presenting David as the ideal king, a prefigure, a foreshadowing of the perfect Messiah to come.
So it's like he's saying, see this awesome king, the Messiah is going to be even better.
Exactly. And he even adds material to David's story, things we don't see in Samuel.
Oh, really?
Like David making all these preparations for the temple gathering resources, organizing the Levites, even receiving divine blueprints, just like Moses did for the tabernacle.
Whoa, divine blueprints.
Yeah.
That's taking temple prep to a whole new level.
Right. It elevates David. He's not just a warrior king, he's a divinely inspired builder anticipating the Messiah who will build that ultimate temple. And this leads us to one of the most important passages, the covenant promise to David in 1 Chronicles 17.
What?
It's similar to the one in 2 Samuel 7, but there are some key differences.
Ah, so he's remixing familiar verses to make a new point.
Precisely. In Chronicles, the author tweaks the wording to make it crystal clear that neither David nor Solomon was the Messiah. They were just holding the throne for the true heir, a future king who will fulfill all of God's promises.
So this seemingly minor edit changes the whole game. He's using this familiar story to build anticipation for the future.
And it's incredibly powerful because it reminds us that God's promises are still in play even when things seem bleak.
This is getting good.
Yeah.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's take a quick pause. When we come back, we'll dive into 2 Chronicles and explore how these kings, both good and bad, point us toward the hope of a coming Messiah. All right, we're back and ready to tackle 2 Chronicles. Now, if you're thinking more kings, haven't we had enough of those already? Well, just wait. This is where the plot thickens.
It does indeed.
Yeah.
In 2 Chronicles, our author shifts the focus to the kings who reigned in Jerusalem after David. But here's the interesting part. He completely ignores the kings of the northern kingdom. It's like they've been edited out of the story entirely.
So it's not just like a chronological history, it's more like a highlight reel with a very specific message in mind.
Exactly. Remember those 2 major themes from 1 Chronicles? The Messianic King and the glorious new temple?
Yeah.
Well, they're front and center here too. By focusing solely on the kings of the Davidic line, the author is emphasizing the lineage from which the Messiah is promised to come.
It's like he's saying, pay attention, folks. This is the family tree that matters.
Precisely. And he doesn't just tell us who these kings were, he tells us what kind of kings they were. He adds new material that highlights the consequences of their choices. Obedience to God brings blessings, while disobedience leads to disaster and exile.
So it's not just a history lesson. It's a morality play almost.
You could say that it's like a series of case studies for the people of Israel, showing them what happens when you follow God and what happens when you don't.
And I bet those stories really resonated with his audience living in the aftermath of exile themselves.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that their future, just like the kings before them, hinges on their faithfulness to God and his law.
So we've got these kings, their reigns, their triumphs and failures, all pointing back to those two big themes of the Messiah and the temple. But then we get to the end of 2 Chronicles, and it's a bit of a head-scratcher.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
The book ends with Cyrus the Persian king giving the Israelites permission to return from exile and rebuild the temple, and then bam, in complete sentence, it's like the author just ran out of ink.
I know. I remember reading that and thinking, wait, is that it? What about the rebuilding? What about the Messiah? It's such a weird way to end a book, especially one that's been building up to this, moment of restoration.
It is unexpected. But remember, the author isn't just writing a history book. He's using the past to shape the present and point toward the future. And this abrupt ending is actually a brilliant literary device.
Okay, I'm listening. How does an unfinished sentence point to the future?
Well, we know from other historical accounts that some of the exiles did return, and they began rebuilding. But it wasn't the glorious messianic restoration they were hoping for. Things were still messy, the temple wasn't what it used to be, and the nations weren't exactly flocking to Israel's leadership.
So the author's kind of leaving us hanging intentionally, like he's saying this isn't the end of the story.
Exactly. By ending with this incomplete sentence, this unfulfilled longing, he's pointing towards a future return, a time when the Messiah will come rebuild the temple and usher in the era of peace and prosperity that God promised.
So it's not just an abrupt ending, it's a cliffhanger. He's leaving his audience wanting more, longing for that ultimate fulfillment.
Precisely. And this brings us to a crucial question. If Chronicles ends with this longing for the future, how does that shape our understanding of the entire Old Testament? We'll explore that thought-provoking question when we return for our final segment.
Okay, we're back for our final segment of this deep dive into Chronicles, and I gotta say, this book is way more complex than I originally thought.
It is quite the work.
It's not just like a history rehash.
Yeah.
It's a carefully crafted story, all designed to inspire hope in this community that's struggling to find its place.
It is a masterful work. And remember how we were talking about Chronicles being the last book in the Jewish Bible? That placement is crucial to understanding its message.
Right. It's like the grand finale of the Old Testament.
Exactly. And that finale ends with a cliffhanger, an unfulfilled longing for the Messiah and this glorious future. So if Chronicles, with all its emphasis on the Davidic king and that promise of a new temple, if that's a concluding chapter of the Jewish scriptures, what does that tell us about the Old Testament as a whole?
It's like the author saying this isn't the end. There's more to come.
Yeah. Exactly. Chronicles points us toward a future that lies beyond the pages of the Old Testament. It invites us to keep reading, to see how that story unfolds, and to discover how the hopes and promises woven throughout these ancient texts find their ultimate fulfillment.
So in a way, Chronicles is like a bridge between the Old and the New Testament. It's looking back at the past, grounding us in the promises God made to his people. But it's also pointing us forward, preparing us for what's to come.
It is a bridge, and if we follow that bridge, we discover that Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of all those hopes and promises. He's the true Davidic king, the one who establishes God's kingdom, and his sacrifice on the cross becomes the foundation for a new kind of temple.
Oh, wow.
One that's not made of stone, but of living stones, his followers.
I never thought about it like that before.
Yeah.
It makes you want to go back and reread the entire Old Testament with fresh eyes.
It really does. Chronicles reminds us that the Bible isn't just this collection of random stories and laws. It's one big, interconnected narrative, a love story between God and humanity that culminates in the coming of Jesus.
So for anyone out there who might be familiar with the Old Testament but hasn't really delved into the New Testament yet, Chronicles is like an invitation. It's like the author's whispering, hey, there's more to the story. Keep reading.
Yes, and what a story it is. The coming of Jesus, his life, death, and resurrection, all of it fulfills those hopes and promises woven throughout the Old Testament. It's the climax of the story that began way back in Genesis.
Well, we started this deep dive thinking Chronicles might be a bit of a rerun, but it turns out to be this really powerful and moving testament to God's faithfulness and the enduring hope that we have in him.
It is a testament. Chronicles reminds us that even when things look bleak, Even when it feels like God's promises are on hold, we can trust that he's working behind the scenes orchestrating his plan of redemption. And ultimately, that plan leads us to Jesus, the one who brings hope and restoration to a broken world.
So as you go about your week, remember that the story isn't over. God's still writing new chapters, and each one is filled with his love, grace, and unending faithfulness. Keep exploring, keep seeking, and keep trusting in the one who holds all things together.